I hope you can now see the slides. Excellent. So, yeah, what I want to talk about today is actually dishonest behavior and specifically the paradox of dishonesty, namely how people lie, but at the same time still feel moral, which is quite a consistent finding in the literature. But before we dive into that, let's first of all see why we as psychologists should take care of or should try to understand dishonest behavior at all. And one point that we see is that actually dishonest behavior is pretty common in everyday life. You just have to open the newspapers and you will see many, many headlines. Here are just a few prominent examples of people who have been dishonest, who have lied, who have committed fraud, or anything like that. The list could go on for hours, but we also don't need to necessarily look into the newspapers. I'm sure that you also know many examples from your day-to-day social interactions where people have been dishonest. There is a high proportion also of sexual infidelity, of more minor ethical transgressions, and so on and so forth. One of these problems is that actually the social and also the societal costs of dishonest behavior are tremendous. And so it's an important, or it has become an important field of research in psychology, but also beyond in other behavioral and social sciences that tries to understand why people do lie and under what conditions they do, and also who lies. But what does that actually mean? What is a lie? And I present here a working definition that is pretty well established in the literature and also used by myself in this talk, considering a lie as a false statement or a false presentation where the person who tells the lie knows that it is untrue. And there is also the idea that lying doesn't happen just coincidentally, but people have an intention to deceive. And that differentiates a lie from just conveying or presenting wrong information, but actually believing that one has presented it in the correct way. Lying is really known to be false and intended to deceive others. So here is also another definition that also once again emphasizes that usually lying has a certain motive beyond a desire to make someone believe it. So really the intention to deceive. But also a motive for oneself, namely utility maximization. You have to gain something from the lie. You just lie because you think that you gain an advantage from it. That's the idea. When we want to study dishonesty, of course, we do have to measure it. And when it comes to dishonest behavior, it's actually pretty tricky because can we really ask someone whether they lied and they will honestly report about their dishonesty? Is that really something we can expect? So that puts us into the challenging situation that we have to find a measure for dishonest behavior. And here, what we usually do, and what I've been done in my research quite often, is actually to use some cheating paradigms that have been developed in behavioral economics. They try to measure dishonest behavior in a consequential way, meaning that people, depending on whether they are dishonest or honest, actually receive a certain, for example, monetary amount for their behavior. So they have a consequence of the behavior. It's not just telling something, but actually something that is consequential. And what is also important is that in these paradigms, we can measure lying, but still ensure that lying remains anonymous for each and every single individual. And how that works, I can show you in a bit. And why it is important is because dishonesty is pretty socially undesirable. So people may not want to be exposed as a cheater, and that's why we have to try to ensure their anonymity and protect them from being exposed. So how that works is, for example, can be seen in the die under cup task, which is a very commonly used cheating paradigm. And in this task, people usually, in the first place, get a target number. So they get a dice and a target number, say the number 5 as here in this example. Then they are asked to roll the die privately. So here, this is from a study by Shaul Shalvi and colleagues, where they gave people a cup, and in that cup they had a dice. And as you can see, people were asked to roll it and then to have a look at the outcome. And only the person themselves can actually see the outcome. The experimenter doesn't know the actual outcome of the dice. Participants are then simply asked whether they obtained the target number that they received beforehand. And if they say, yes, I rolled the correct number, they will get a certain monetary amount. And if they say no, just nothing happens. So they will not get anything and go away empty-handed. So as is obvious for this person, for example, for each specific individual, we do not know whether they actually rolled the target number or whether they just stated that they rolled it. But what we do know is that on average, based on the expected value using a fair die, a fair six-sided die, the probability of a yes response, namely of rolling the target number, is 1 in 6, 16.7%. And now we can see, okay, how many people actually reported that they rolled the target number. And what is usually reported in the literature is that around 35 to 40% claim that they rolled the target number. So roughly 50% of the wins are illegitimate. So we do know that in these paradigms, lying does happen. And it happens even though the incentives, like the monetary amount at stake, is pretty low, usually like say €5, something like that, or $5. Despite observing quite some dishonest behavior, not only in these laboratory tasks, in these cheating paradigms, but also in daily life, as I had presented in the very beginning, most people think of themselves as moral and honest, and indeed more moral than others. And this is very nicely illustrated by Donald Trump, who once said, I think I'm almost too honest to be a politician. And in some respect, that might be true, but we also know that he's often lying. So this very well demonstrates this, actually. Why do have people this tendency to morally self-enhance? Why do they want to see themselves as moral and maybe more moral than they actually are? Well, on the one hand, there have been propositions that people have a need for moral identity. They just want to feel as moral beings, and that has been proposed to be a basic psychological need. We just don't want to think of ourselves as bad people. In addition, it's very important for us to have a moral reputation, to be seen as moral and as honest by others. Also because whenever you select a certain interaction partner, we usually want to select those who we perceive as moral and as honest interaction partners. And so if we believe we are moral, then it's also much easier to convey the impression to others and to be selected as interaction partners. In order to ensure that actually that people sometimes behave dishonestly, but at the same time also feel honest, they engage in what has been called ethical maneuvering, which is defined as the tendency for people to compromise between, on the one hand, their desire to be honest and morally appropriate, but on the other hand, to also serve their financial self-interest. So it's always sort of like a balance between these two desires. And one thing that actually helps people to maneuver and to feel moral despite lying is whenever there are justifications present. And these justifications are in that sense self-serving because they provide people with reasons for questionable behaviors, including immoral behaviors or dishonesty, and making these actions appear less unethical. So they can actually lie but still feel moral. So justifications help for moral self-enhancement and ethical maneuvering. There are different types of these justifications. First of all, the context or the situation, like the state, can give you a certain justification for lying. There also seem to be certain person characteristics that help people to justify lying. People differ in how easy they find it to justify lying. So there is sort of a trait justifiability. And there is also person-situation interactions. And these different types of justifications is now what I want to speak about in the remainder of my talk and give you some examples for research that we've done on these different justifications. Let's first of all start with the situation and how that shapes dishonest behavior. We conducted a study where we specifically looked at the social justifiability of dishonesty, meaning that dishonesty had a certain social consequence, so a consequence, a positive consequence for another person. How did we do that? So we used the cheating paradigms very similar to the one that I presented before, not the die rolling task, but in this case, the coin toss task. It works exactly or follows exactly the same logic, just not rolling a die, but flipping a coin, and you give a target side to individuals in the beginning, say heads, and then people are asked to toss the coin twice. And if they report that they tossed heads twice, they will receive the amount of money that's at stake. And if they say no, nothing happens. Again, we don't know the outcome of the coin toss because people did that online. So they did it at home and we couldn't observe them, and they just reported whether they obtained the target side twice. What we then did is that we had multiple trials, so multiple conditions within subjects, where we manipulated the consequences of reporting yes in this coin toss task. At the very extremes, on the one hand, we had an other only condition. If people said, yes, I received the target side twice, another person, like another participant, received 10 euros. The person themselves did not receive anything. So self-profit was 0, but the social welfare sort of was maximal in the sense of that someone else received that money. In the pro-self condition, by contrast, by responding yes, people received 5 euro, but no one else received anything. So it was just the pro-self lying is what we call. What is important here is that the amount that people themselves got was lower than the amount that the other got in the other only condition. And now, basically in the intermediate conditions, we varied that continuously. So as you can see, for example, in condition number 3, participants themselves received 2 euro for a lie, or for a yes response, sorry. And the other person would receive 6 euro. So overall, the social welfare, which is our measure in that sense, or our manipulation of social justifiability, is a little bit lower than in the other only condition, but it is still given. What we then did is that sort of like the math behind the scenes is we used multinomial processing tree modeling to estimate the probability of dishonesty in each condition. Again, we cannot observe participants, so we can only estimate the probability of dishonesty based on people's yes responses. And what we then did is that we implemented or we tested specific trends in the probability of dishonesty across these conditions, in order to see whether it is more important for people to profit themselves from lying, or if it's more important that lying is socially justifiable because someone else gets a gain or gets an outcome. If self-profit truly outweighs the social justifiability, what we should see in the probability of lying is that people are more willing to lie, and most willing to lie actually, in the pro-self cheating condition when they get 5 euro for a lie. And the probability of lying should decrease the lower the gain for the person themselves is. If, in contrast, social justifiability is the key driver of dishonest behavior, we should see exactly the opposite trend, meaning the highest dishonesty probability in the other only condition and the lowest in the pro-self condition. So these were two trends that we tested against each other. And as a comparison, we also tested if there is maybe no specific trend and just randomly and freely estimated the different dishonesty probabilities. And these three conditions, or these three model specifications more correctly, were then compared using the MPT model in order to estimate a posterior probability of each of these models given the data in comparison to the other competing models. Here is the results. First of all, let's just look at the estimated probability of dishonesty by condition. You can see at the very left is the other only condition, and on the very right is the pro-self condition. Here is the probability of dishonesty. And what we then saw when we tested this with our MPT modeling is that the data was pretty well aligned with our model that self-profit outweighs just social justifiability, meaning an increasing trend of dishonesty the higher the self-profit was. But as you can also see, there is one exception, and that is the condition where participants received 4 euro, but at the same time, lying was socially justifiable. So it seems that here, especially, people were more willing to lie because they themselves gained quite a decent amount. But at the same time, they could justify it very easily by saying, well, someone else profited and it was not just myself. So it's not only self-profit, but also the just social justifiability that drives dishonesty. That's at least our conclusion from this study. Another study that we did looked at the incentives at stake. You can easily imagine that, of course, we can just vary the amount that people can gain when they respond yes in these paradigms. The economic perspective is very clear. Economists would say, well, dishonesty should just increase with increasing benefits. So basically the pattern that we saw in the previous study, with the exception of the pro-self condition. However, when we look at empirical evidence, it is actually mixed. So there are meta-analyses that looked at whether the amount that people receive, the bonus of dishonesty, so to say, did not in these meta-analyses show a clear trend towards more dishonesty with increasing incentives. There is a slight positive trend for higher levels of dishonesty with increasing incentives, but this is only the case in some paradigms. And as you can also see in that graph, it's pretty small, the increase in the dishonesty prevalence. There is even a finding that there is a negative effect on the incentives on civic dishonesty. What is that? In that study, people or the researchers measured whether people would return a lost wallet to like a certain authority. And what they found is that the more money was in the wallet, the more likely people were to return it. So this is the exact opposite of what an economics perspective would predict. Why is that? Well, we can also somehow try to explain these findings based on the justifiability of lying, because incentives may actually affect the justifiability of lying. On the one hand, increasing benefits may indeed also increase the justifiability of lying, because people may think, well, I would be stupid not to lie because there is so much money at stake. I mean, who wouldn't do it in that case? So it's pretty easy to justify in this way. Then again, people may also have the feeling that, whoa, if there is really a lot of money at stake, someone else has to pay for it. So it may actually decrease the justifiability of lying, because it's getting more and more difficult for people to justify a very severe lie where they gain a lot and someone else loses a lot. So opposing predictions. In order to test that, actually what we did then is a study, a multi-trial study, once again, this time with the die under cup task that I presented earlier. So we brought people to the lab and tried to set up or use the same setup that Shalvi and colleagues also used. But what we did is we manipulated the incentives within subjects in 3 consecutive blocks. In one block, the incentive was €10 on average for a yes response. In one, it was €50, and in another block, it was actually €100 for a yes response in that block. For each block, we had 20 to 40 trials randomly chosen for each participant. And we then, at the very end, chose one trial per block randomly and paid participants according to their response in that particular trial. So overall, participants could gain maximally 175% if, for example, 3 trials were chosen where they responded yes. And also the incentives varied a little bit around the 10, 50 and €100, just to not bore participants too much. And so overall, we had also some trials where we had 15, 55 and €105. So if someone was really lucky and those trials were selected, they could gain up to €175. Once again, cheating was completely anonymous because we didn't know what people actually rolled. But it's important to note that, of course, if someone tells us throughout all the trials that they rolled the target number, this pattern is so unlikely that we can be very sure that someone was lying. But still, of course, people were paid by someone else, like another experimenter than the ones in the room. So we still tried to keep everything anonymous. As you can imagine, this could be a very expensive study, and that's why we were only able to collect data from 35 participants, but that's why we had such a high number of trials to still be able to accurately estimate the proportion of dishonesty in for each and every single individual. When we now look at the aggregate level, the probability of lying for the 3 different incentive blocks, what we actually saw is very well in line with meta-analyses, namely, overall, no effect of incentive size, a very, very small trend towards higher dishonesty with increasing incentives, but this was not significant, and overall very similar probabilities. But when we looked at the individual level, what we actually saw is that the effect of incentive size differed between individuals. Some individuals always lied. We called them brazen liars. They basically said yes all the time. But this was a minority. Only 6% in our study, actually just 2 people. What was more common was that people were basically honest. 40% of our participants, their trajectory of responses was estimated to be best described by someone who's just truly honest throughout. So I think that's actually quite good news. For others, however, there was an effect of incentive. So for the upper 2, like the brazen and honest people, we didn't see any effect of incentives. But we had some participants, we called them the corruptibles, for whom the probability of dishonesty increased with increasing incentives. So exactly what the economics perspective would predict. But what is very interesting is that we also saw exactly the opposite pattern for some. We called them small sinners. And it seems that for some people, the higher the incentive at stake, the lower their probability of dishonesty. Maybe because the lie gets more severe with increasing incentives. And that pattern also shows why, on average, we usually cannot see an effect of incentives on dishonesty just because different people react differently to increasing incentives, and so it cancels each other out. What this study also showed us once more is that we should actually take into consideration the person, because there are individual differences. And so the next topic will actually also look into person characteristics that shape dishonest behavior. I would consider myself a personality psychologist, so that's of course why I also looked into which personality traits actually predict dishonest behavior. As mentioned before, there is consistent individual differences in dishonesty. And so we thought maybe it is the case that some people just find it easier to justify lying than others. When we now look at personality traits, a prime candidate to explain these individual differences is honesty-humility, as conceptualized in the Hexaco personality model. The Hexaco is a variation and slight extension of the more well-known Big Five, and it adds this 6th personality trait, honesty-humility, which is defined on a dimension from low levels, which are characterized by someone being pretty sly, greedy, boastful, deceitful, and so on and so forth, and high levels characterizing people who are usually sincere, honest, modest, faithful, and so on. So just by definition, if honesty, humility can be measured in a valid way, it should help us explain individual differences in dishonest behavior. And fortunately, that is also what we see. We conducted a reanalysis across 16 studies at the time that investigated dishonesty in cheating paradigms and also measured self-reported honesty humility levels. And we found a medium-sized effect, a negative relation between honesty, humility, and the probability of dishonesty. This finding is also, like, after our meta study or reanalysis in 2018, this is really one of the most robust findings I've ever seen in personality psychology. So pretty reliable. What we also recently did is we tried to estimate whether there is a link between the consistency of dishonest behavior over time and personality. So what we did is we measured dishonest behavior at 3 time points with these cheating paradigms, but with different cheating paradigms. Between the first 2 was 5 months, and between the second 2 measurement points, we had 31 months, so more than 2 years. What we did see actually, first of all, is that dishonesty at these different time points, and this was all one-shot paradigms that I really have to emphasize, because the correlations between dishonesty at these different time points was very sizable, with large-sized correlations between time 1 and 2 and 2 and 3, and a medium-sized correlation between 1 and 3, which is more than 3 years of time. And honesty, humility, as we had expected, also predicted the consistency in dishonesty. So not just single dishonest acts, but someone who scores high on honesty, humility was actually very likely to never lie in these paradigms, and someone who was low in honesty, humility usually lied at least once or twice. Okay, so now that we've seen that both the situation and the person seem to shape dishonest behavior, let's look at whether there is also interactions, meaning that certain people behave more dishonest or less dishonestly in certain types of situations. As mentioned before, we have some situations that render lying more easily justifiable than others. And what I've presented here was, first of all, the social justifiability with incentives for others, but also the size of incentives. And then we've also seen these stable individual differences accounted for by honesty, humility. So let's bring them together. In one study that we recently conducted together with a colleague in Melbourne, Luke Smiley, is that we manipulated whether people had justifications or excuses for lying because they observed desired counterfactuals. In terms of a die rolling paradigm, this looks as follows. We again had a multi-round die rolling task, and within subjects, we manipulated whether people rolled the die once or 3 times. But irrespective of whether they rolled once or 3 times, only one roll counted for payment. But as you can imagine, if you say the first roll is decisive, you do not roll the target number in the first, but in the second, which could have also been the first, right? So it provides you an excuse to say, well, I basically rolled the target number, maybe not in the right trial, but I did. So the idea is that this increases the justifiability. We also measured honesty, humility, and then checked whether with between the 1 and 3 trial condition, there was actually a difference. First of all, what we saw is that there was a consistent negative relation between honesty, humility, and dishonesty, as presented before, very consistent. However, irrespective of whether people rolled once or 3 times, so irrespective of the justifiability of dishonesty, this relationship was just consistent. So people high in honesty, humility even did not lie when it was easier to justify lying. In another study, we then thought, well, maybe we can make people high in honesty, humility lie when lying is pro-social. Why is that? Well, people high in honesty, humility, they are also very pro-social. So they actually cooperate more, they give more in donation settings and so on and so forth. So they should actually be motivated to be pro-social. But what happens if being pro-social is only possible by lying to someone? And that is exactly what we wanted to test. So we used a one-shot, again, coin toss task in this study, and we manipulated who the beneficiary of the yes response was. In one condition, it was just the self. So that mimics the pro-self condition from one of the earlier studies that I presented. In another condition, another participant was the beneficiary of lying, and it was another participant with an average income. So we called that non-needy. It was just someone who actually has a pretty decent income. But in the needy other condition, we selected another participant who had an income below the poverty level in the respective country. We did that via Prolific, where you can actually select recipients based on their income that they reported. So there were actual participants who received that money. So we did not deceive participants, but we actually paid it out to participants. And the idea was that, of course, it is more pro-social to lie when someone else profits, and even more pro-social when that other person is sort of needy. So here are the results in relation to honesty, humility. Surprising to us, actually, there was still a very consistent relation between honesty, humility, and dishonest behavior, irrespective of who benefited from the lie. So it seems that people high in honesty, humility actually do refrain from lying and do not even consider lying to be justifiable when someone who is needy would profit from the lie. So to summarize and conclude, first of all, as I hope to have shown you, is that people can justify their dishonesty in various ways. So we do, for example, see that dishonesty levels are affected by certain state factors, certain factors of the context, such as the incentive at stake, but only when others also profit, because in our other study, as mentioned, incentives had a different effect on different individuals. We also see very consistent trait factors underlying dishonest behavior, so very consistent individual differences that we can account for by trait honesty, humility as one of the very consistent predictors here. And so we can conclude that people can act immorally, but still feel moral in some sense. How do we also come to that conclusion? Well, we have some findings where we simply asked participants how they would assess their own level of honesty, humility. So do they really overestimate their honesty, humility? Do they really feel very moral, even though we observe these individual differences in dishonesty? And what you can see here is when we ask them to estimate their own level, most people considered themselves to be above average in honesty, humility. And this was exactly 70% of our participants. And if we take the average seriously, this pattern is just impossible, right? And as you can also see, there was just a very small minority of people who reported that they consider themselves to be below average on honesty, humility. Interestingly, we do not see such a pattern for other personality traits, even other socially desirable personality traits. There we found that usually there was a pretty usual bell curve normal distribution, most people considering themselves average, and then a very nice curve around that. This overestimation of people's honesty, humility, and maybe morality more generally also has implications, not only for people's self-views, but also for their goals to change. There is some research going on in personality psychology on personality change goals. So most people actually do report that they want to change certain aspects of their personality. Most people, for example, report that they want to have lower levels of neuroticism or maybe somewhat higher levels of extroversion. Interestingly, however, when we look at honesty, humility, and other morality-related traits, people usually do not see a need to change for the better. So they don't have any change goals. So here in one of our studies, we've observed that roughly 30% of participants reported goals to change on honesty, humility, whereas for other traits, it was between 70 and 80%. So really much, much higher. And this was also unaffected, or if at all, only slightly affected by people's honesty, humility level. So irrespective of whether they score high or low on honesty, humility, they usually do not report any change goals. For other traits, again, as a comparison, this pattern looks very differently because people who have lower levels, for example, on extroversion, are the ones who want to increase and not the ones who already have very high levels. But here for honesty, humility, it seems like the pattern is different. However, once we provide participants with some information about their honesty, humility levels, once we gave them personality feedback, the pattern changed pretty dramatically. We saw that around 2/3 of participants who scored relatively low on honesty, humility, after giving them personality feedback, now also said, oh, yes, maybe I should change. But of course, if people do not see a need, if they think, oh, I'm actually performing quite well, I'm actually pretty moral, why would they want to change? And that's why sort of like holding up a mirror to them in that particular study seems to be helpful. We then also built on that research and conducted another study to better understand these processes and better understand what people make out of personality feedback and how it affects their personality change goals. So we did an interview study with 35 participants. We provided these participants with feedback on different morality-related traits, for example, honesty, but also fairness, gratitude, and modesty, for example. And then we did not only measure people's self-reports, but we also invited people to assess or to forward the questionnaire to informants who know the person well. So each participant in the final sample actually had at least 3 to 5 informants, for example, family members, friends, acquaintances, whatever, who reported on their personality. And then based on these informant reports, we also provided people with feedback on the aggregated informant report, the aggregated level, for example, in this case, of honesty that informants assigned to them. So people could actually see whether there is a discrepancy between their self-assessment and the assessment of informants, and then learn more about themselves in this way. We then did an interview with them. So we had a coach who then afterwards did a 1-hour interview with participants and asked them what they think of the feedback, what they make of the feedback. We also gave them a questionnaire, of course. But we, as I said, we wanted to understand the processes a little bit better. And here I just brought 2 exemplary quotes from that study from participants where you can actually see that they did think about the feedback and actually also then saw that there is a certain need to change. Someone, for example, said, "That's actually good feedback. I know I have to work on it. I am working on it." Another person said, "If that is how I presented myself and how other people perceive me even less than that, I want to do better." So you can see that by sort of giving people the opportunity to reflect on their own traits, they might then also develop certain change goals, which then in turn is the basis, the requirement for actual personality change. Of course, that's then the next step and it's difficult, but if we can't instill a goal to change in the first place, then we will also not help people change their personality traits. So we thought this is very promising initial evidence. So to wrap up, I try a positive takeaway, speaking of dishonesty, but still trying sort of to be positive in the end. What we see in our studies is that actually many people are honest and incorruptible, even in settings that are completely anonymous, where they can just lie and receive a certain monetary gain. Many people are still honest and do not lie. And this is even the case if we give people the justifiability to lie, if we make it easier to lie for them. This is also sort of repeating what I just said. So even if we give people justifications in the sense of being pro-social, even then there is many people whom we cannot sort of convince, who we cannot make lying. And also, it seems that we can motivate people to change for the better once we help them see themselves sort of more clearly and through less rose-colored glasses. And with that, I want to thank you for your attention. And of course, also all my wonderful collaborators on this line of research, the funding bodies here. And yes, with that, I'm very much looking forward to your questions and thank you for your attention.
Fantastic. Thank you.